Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another class, another episode. And I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Tremblay. He's an adjunct instructor for the Lee Honors College at Western Michigan University. And he's here because a few months ago, about a year ago, I heard him talk to Ryan Beckman and Dr. Howie DeBlasi on my Disney Classroom podcast about a really, really interesting class he teaches for the Lee Honors College at Western Michigan University. So I won't give anything away. Um, Dr. Tremblay, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining. And it's good to have you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be here. I always like talking about Disney and Walt and all things connected to those two topics.
Awesome. Well, so then let's get into it. One, tell us your origin story, how you got introduced to Disney, built
Mhm.
your fandom to Disney, to now teaching this amazing class that you get to teach. And you can talk about the class and then we'll get into it.
Sure.
We'll dive into it more after that also.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my origin story starts when I was 5 years old. And really, my parents, we would take our motorhome down to Florida to visit my grandma in Tampa. And of course, we had to go to Walt Disney World, which at the time was just the Magic Kingdom. So I remember going when I was 5 and 7 and just being enthralled. And when I was a kid, we actually would go to the park on Christmas Day, which back then was a little bit sacrilegious. It's not what it is today. So, of course, the park was empty because everyone else was at church and, we were off, at the Magic Kingdom. So, besides that, I also just grew up with obviously the Disney classic movies, going to the theater to see them. And I had my own Disney book collection and my special Mickey Mouse holder. I had, Mickey Mouse sheets on my bed. So I was surrounded by, all of the Disney merchandise, and really was a fan of Mickey Mouse. And so then I think as I got older and started learning more about, the company and how it got started, obviously you start learning about the life of Walt Disney. So I would do, some course papers in high school that were on a Disney topic. And then when I was in high school, that's when I learned about the Disney College program. And so, of course, going through traditions, the orientation for cast members at the time was just, I was just drinking out of a fire hose, but also just learning so much about Walt's history. And so I think that really planted the seed. And then it was really in 2013 when I went to Chicago to the Museum of Science and Industry to go to the Walt Disney Archives exhibit, the Treasures of Walt Disney. And I was reminded that Walt was born in Chicago. Most people don't know that or didn't realize he was a Midwesterner. And then lived in Marceline. So my whole plan was I was inspired by that. And I was telling my friend Julia about it that I was like, hey, I'm going to find my Disney fan friends and we're going to do a road trip from Kalamazoo, Michigan. We're going to go to the birthplace, which wasn't open to the public, right? Still just as open to the public. And then drive to Marceline, right? This was going to be a big road trip. And she was like, wait a second. You need to pitch that as a study in the States course for the Lee Honors College. And I was like, right, but I'm not a faculty member. And she's like, go talk to the dean. And so I talked to the dean, and I don't want to say the rest is history, but um, you know, I can go through the details of how it came to be. But that's essentially, my little simple road trip then became like a curriculum and a travel course.
Yeah. And the class itself is so interesting. The idea of the class is so interesting. One, I do want to make one quick point. You mentioned going to Walt Disney World or the Magic Kingdom on Christmas Day. I think people listening or watching on YouTube who, if they've ever been to any of the parks on any holiday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, especially New Year's, I think that's, you talking about the parks being empty? That would be a very, very big surprise for a
Right.
lot of people.
Yeah. And one of my favorite things was that I remember, having access to all of the characters who were just walking around the park, right? Today, they're in staged areas. You have to line up, get your picture. I mean, it was like free flowing.
Yeah,
You could go up and hug them, right? And so I have all these photos of just these impromptu character visits, which to me just was like one of the coolest things when you're that age.
yeah. And I'm actually looking at pictures right now of there's pictures of me with Pluto in front of the castle, and there's pictures of me with Figment and the original Dreamfinder because they were just strolling around, and that's one of the things I understand now. You have to have the lines, you have to have all of that for crowd control. It's also really, really, or something I really like about going to Disney California Adventure and going to Avengers Campus is because those characters are roaming around. Now they do have set meet and greets, and the roaming characters you're not supposed to stop and try to take pictures with and everything. They're there, being Avengers and on Avengers official Avengers business. But it is really neat that they're able to do that. And I know that happens a little bit more in Disneyland than it does in Walt Disney World also. Um, but moving on to your idea for the road trip.
Mhm.
Um, how we first got in touch is actually through Sumner Nesbitt, who
Oh,
works at
right.
the Walt Disney Hometown Museum. And he told me about Highway 36 in Missouri, that it's called the Way of American Genius because of all the different historical stops along the way. And, uh, it starts in Hannibal, where Mark Twain grew up, and then it goes through Marceline, and it ends in St. Joseph, Missouri, which I believe is where maybe the Wells Fargo started, and there's other things along the way. There's all these different stops, like where I think even where like sliced bread was first created and everything. And it's so interesting to do that. And I want to do that trip at one point. I want to start in Hannibal and make my way over because we have family that lives in northern Missouri and then also in Nebraska. So we actually make that trip sometimes, but I've never been able to go up to Marceline.
Oh,
And so that's a trip that I want to make
yeah.
as well to see all of that and hopefully get in and visit with Sumner and see the town and different things like that. So that's
It's a must.
really,
It's a
really
must
fun.
visit. It's funny that you mentioned the home of sliced bread because the students and I went there this year. We had a little bit of extra
Okay.
time, and so because it's on the route, they did think it was pretty cool, and so
Yeah.
we did a photo op there, and it's not too far from Marceline. So,
So the class, do you follow Highway 36 through Missouri? Is that how you get through Missouri?
sort of. So, we drive from Kalamazoo to Chicago, and then Chicago to Marceline. So we obviously go through Hannibal, Missouri, and that's the route. And then we do come across 36 and then head to Marceline, and then we go to Kansas City. So again, we're back on that kind of route, heading
Okay.
southwest from there. So,
Okay.
so we see some of those sites that you mentioned, or we go by them, but
Yeah.
yeah, Missouri's pretty fortunate that they had so many innovators, and they developed that kind of trail to
I
follow.
know it's such a neat like tourism draw for the state. So about the class, it's called Walt's Pilgrimage. Tell us what the synopsis of the class is, or
Mhm.
kind of the I guess the what the students would see as the promotion for the class.
Right.
And then we'll get into uh, talking about the actual itinerary of the class.
Mhm. Yeah, so Walt's Pilgrimage is essentially an 8-day travel course through the life of Walt Disney from his birthplace to his gravesite. And essentially, we visit 40 places in Walt Disney's life in those 8 days, places where he lived, worked, and played. So, really giving them a sense of who the person was that founded the Walt Disney Company. As most of my students remind me, they know the Disney brand, they've been to the parks, they've seen the movies, but they have no concept of the person where all of this innovation, creativity, and work came from. And some may have had a little bit of exposure, right? They may have done a small book
Mhm.
report on Walt Disney or picked Walt Disney as the person that they're going to dress up as for school or for, something else. So most of them are fascinated, and I think they're intrigued about, kind of walking in his footsteps in chronological order. I think that's what also makes it unique. That we get to do that. And, fortunately for us, we're located in a place that we can start chronologically and go through. And so, throughout those days, we're going to the sites, some of which exist, some of which may no longer exist, but they were places where things happened. Meeting Disney historians, people who met Walt Disney, people who, worked with him. And then, obviously going to Disneyland. That's kind of almost a no-brainer that we need to include that. And then concluding at his gravesite where we reflect on his legacy that he left and all the things that we get to appreciate today because of, again, one man's dream, not to steal,
Mhm.
the Disney company, but the concept. And so I think the biggest thing is students see lots of themes in Walt's life. And we talk about the highs and the lows for him, right? It wasn't all, flowers and sunshine
Mhm.
for him. And if he hadn't been persistent, we might not see some of these things that we get to enjoy today.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a biographical, journey. And I have students from all different majors in it. It's because it's in the honors college. I've had aviation majors, I've had nursing majors, I've had film, students, communications majors, psychology, and I think most everybody finds a little bit of a connection to to their discipline and something they can take from Walt's pilgrimage,
Yeah.
for applying it.
Have you ever, you mentioned you've had film students. Have you ever had anyone approach you for a project to, hey, let's document this and let's have some type of video presentation of
Yeah.
this, whether it's a documentary, what short term, short form, long form, anything?
So I did have a film student who did, I think she just did some small clips. It wasn't necessarily for a class assignment, and I don't remember what she did with it, but I know that she did do a compilation. If there is one thing that's still on my bucket list or wish list would be to kind of have somebody follow us,
Yeah.
on the journey. I'll plant the seed here that I think it actually would be a perfect story for like CBS Sunday morning,
Yeah.
kind of feel good, like, kind of thing. So, or NPR. I feel like NPR, like those
Yeah.
listeners, I think could follow us, and we could connect with other NPR kind of stations throughout the travels. But it hasn't come to fruition yet, but it's still on my, list.
Yeah.
Because again, if I had $1 for every time somebody was like, "Oh, I wish I could take your class,"
Yeah.
or "I wish I could experience it," at least a documentary would give them a taste. But that's also, and we'll come back to this, but that's also what motivated me to publish the book
Yeah.
that, gives people the chance to do their own version of Walt's pilgrimage in whatever region of the country or however motivated they are to do it.
Yeah. And it's such a cool, like I said, it's such a cool idea. It's really, really cool that the students get to do this. So it's within the 8 days. Well, first, what prep work do the students do before the 8 day trip?
Yeah. So we're pretty fortunate that we do a pre kind of field trip within Michigan. So just about 30 minutes northeast of Kalamazoo is the Gilmore Car Museum. And there's a Disney set piece that is at that museum.
Oh, okay.
See, many people don't realize that Walt Disney was friends with the Gilmore family. They both had summer homes at Smoke Tree Ranch in California. And so Mr. Gilmore was president of the Upjohn Company, which was a big pharmaceutical company at the time. So they became friends, and Mr. Gilmore bought the Rolls Royce that was in the No Mobile movie.
Oh,
And
okay.
when he bought it, Walt goes, "Hey, I'm throwing in an extra gift for you." And he throws in the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids version of the back seat set piece for the No Mobile. Because, back
Oh,
then they didn't have the technology to shrink
yeah.
people. So they built the sets to make the people look like they were small gnomes. So that set piece resides at this museum. And supposedly, it's the only Disney set piece ever to leave Disney property, especially in Walt Disney's time. And so it's kind of cool that there's a piece of Disney history right in our own state. So we start with that. And we talk about Walt's personal relationships, right, with people from Michigan that our students are like, their minds are blown. Like, how could Walt have been to Kalamazoo, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you know, but he made several trips to Michigan. So we also spent some time talking about his visits to Henry Ford Museum and Greenville Village, many of which may have inspired some things that Walt did in his life. So that's the first kind of, travel experience. Again, not very far from Kalamazoo. In terms of their preparation, one of their things that I have them do is I have them watch 20 small little film clips of Walt's work from 1920s all the way through 1966
Okay.
to give them a sense of what he did in the beginning and how that evolved over time. And so they have to do a little bit of like a film clips analysis.
Okay.
uh, and I can always tell when the students' light bulbs are going off while we're traveling, right? When they watch a Laugh-O-Gram film clip, and then we're actually at the Laugh-O-Gram film studio, because I'm like, remember when you watched that clip, this was where this was made, and this is that time period, right? And Walt was your same age, right? That's the other thing that I try to make the connection. Like, I was like, Walt was the president of his own film company at your age. And they're
Yeah.
like, whoa. Um, so that's the assignment. The other thing that they're all doing, the convenient thing about my course is it's 8 days of travel and I have 8 students. So each student is assigned a day to kind of become the tour guide expert.
Yeah.
So they have to do their own research about the sites we're going to. And then they put together a presentation that we do along the journey. And then they also have to prepare a handout for the rest of the students that we
Okay.
compile into a binder. So they collectively can see everybody's work. And then they have to write a reflection paper afterwards.
Okay.
So those are kind of the main kind of components of the assignments.
Uh, Quick question. You have a student assigned to each day to be the expert tour guide. Uh, Obviously you're there. You're giving your insight as well. Uh, do you ever? How much, I guess, like pressure do you feel, or do you ever have to keep yourself? Do you ever have to hold yourself back from jumping in and be like, no, 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 no. This is let me take this day. Like, let me take this.
Oh,
This is something I really, really like talking about.
no, absolutely not. And actually, if you ask that question of other people, would they expect me to have that response? It would probably be no. But most of the time, I would say 95% of the time, what they're sharing is accurate. Sometimes the only time I usually jump in when they're done is I'll correct factual
Hmm.
information. Because again, some of that still, there's lots of different stories about Walt and what may be true or what's myth and what's
Hmm.
fact, because we do spend a lot of time at the different
Okay.
sites talking about, do we think Walt Disney was born in this birthplace? Well, there are no records. There were no hospitals really. Like, people were born in the house. So again, we don't have evidence, but there's all this speculation, right?
Yeah.
And so part of it's teaching the students about that. But usually, what I will do is that if I have other information to supplement what they're talking about, I will add that additional context.
Okay.
Uh, of stuff that they might not have discovered that I just know because of my depth of research. But
I
otherwise, I try to respect, give them their time to shine. And they get to rank order which day they want. And then I basically slot them into a day. And it's always fascinating. Some people who are like, oh, that wasn't the day I wanted. And then at the end of the trip, they were like, oh my God, I'm so glad I had that day. Like
yeah.
I had no idea that this was significant in Walt's life. Because, most people are like, oh, I want Burbank or I want Disneyland.
Hmm.
Or if they have a connection to a city, right? Some people are from Chicago. So they're like, I want to do my hometown. And then they're pleasantly surprised that they're like, oh, actually, I had the best day.
Yeah. Well, and that is something that's really cool because I like me, I would have to fight the urge to jump in and say like, no, let me talk about this because I like talking. I host a podcast about it. But it is really interesting. You said like the students, if they don't get the day that they want, a lot of times they'll come back and say like, oh, I'm really, really happy I got this day. And it's so interesting and so important because it shows some of what people might think of as the minor details. Those are what make a person make the decisions, right?
Right.
I mean, a little stop, a random stop or a random decision made in one spot can carry on. And, maybe 20 years later, that is the kind of the birthplace for a decision that was made that shaped the company, that shaped Disneyland. Do you so about Walt himself on the trip or before or after? Do you ever have conversations in the class about you talk about his legacy? Do you ever talk about some of the controversies
Mhm.
around Walt Disney also?
We
Because that was the first semester I taught this class. I had somebody ask a really, really interesting question at the end of the semester. And I thought, yeah, that's a really, really good question. And so we've kind of built that into the class
Yep.
since then. So how do y'all talk about those things?
Yeah, so it comes up in multiple places. So I think over the years, the first thing I've done, well, let me back up. The one of the required readings is, the Bob Thomas book, Walton, an American Original. So
Mhm.
that one I know doesn't go deep into some of the controversies, but it hits at it enough that the students pick up on it or will ask me questions about it. But I then, over the years, have kind of created a handout that I kind of call like Walt Disney's darkest moments of
Mhm.
things that people don't want to have come up, right? They're tough topics. um so we have a conversation about some of those things like his 1941 strike or his the perceived anti-Semitism, his anti-communist hearings in this with Congress. And but part of it's also talking about in context to what was going on in the
Yeah.
world in America,
Yeah.
right? Because they don't understand what life was like back then, and we obviously have different issues today, some of which could be still the same but different contexts. um, but it also sometimes comes up from the places that we go to, like for example, and this doesn't happen every year, but we've had the chance to have lunch with Floyd Norman. And oftentimes my students will ask questions of people like Floyd, like, what was it like to work with Walt as an African American animator? And did you ever feel like these things that we might have read about? And he has a chance to share his story. Now, his story obviously is only his perspective and
Hmm.
his interactions, which doesn't represent everything. But I think it's then an opportunity to just, it's teaching the students that there's multiple perspectives about every human being's life.
Hmm.
And everybody's not perfect. Walt Disney was not perfect. Yes, he was a lifelong smoker. How did that impact his life,
Hmm.
right? Talking about whether or not he's photographed with or without a cigarette
Yeah.
and what was done behind the scenes. So, yeah, all of that stuff. I like to have it come up a little bit more organically through the conversations, because it's at those moments that I think the students appreciate like learning those things.
Yeah.
Even about the like 5 different ways that Mickey Mouse came to be. right? There's not one single story
Yeah.
that is out there, right? And so, it's also showing students that there are multiple truths out there. We all have to pick which one we think is accurate,
Yeah.
but we will never know for sure. I mean, even though we have what Walt said in print, there's other versions of the same story.
Yeah. What has always been so fascinating to me about Walt the person, and I always say Walt the person because in class I'll talk about Walt Disney and I'm really talking about the company.
Right.
Um, so what has always been fascinating to me about Walt the person and also the Walt Disney Company is it was one of the early examples of how can I say this? Like promoted or in some ways manufactured personality or manufactured character. You mentioned like yes, a person is does positive things that positively impact people. They do things that negatively impact people. I mean there's the movie The Song of the South. The company will never want people to they don't want people to realize that movie it really existed at that point. Although I'm old enough that I actually remember the last time it was released in theaters, going to see it in theaters, because that's when Splash Mountain had opened at the parks. And so you are correct, and I like those conversations about, here's some of the good things, here's some of the not so good things.
Mhm.
And it does there are so many times when people talk about the person that it seems like, yeah, they don't, you don't want to talk about the uncomfortable. And that's understandable because it is uncomfortable. One thing that's so interesting to me is the manufactured character where it I've read Neil Gabler's book more than other ones
Mhm.
where he talks about the smoking.
Mhm.
And he never wanted to be photographed with a cigarette. Never wanted a video camera around when he was smoking a cigarette. And even at one point said something to the effect of, you know, Walt did what the public sees as Walt Disney, they see the character Walt Disney. And
Sure.
this is the persona that we're putting forward. They don't see that Walt Disney is a lifelong smoker. They don't see the times when he gets frustrated or,
Mhm.
argues with people.
Mhm.
And what's so interesting to me about all of that is the time when that was happening, they were one of the first companies to really latch on to television
Mhm.
and not treat television as a major competitor, to use
Mhm.
television to their advantage. And so I think that's why through the embrace of television, through the careful work, let's cultivate this persona that we want. I think that's why people see the individual as Uncle Walt, because so to me, it's just so interesting that when you talk about entertainment and you talk about marketing, that they really were, he and the company were so far ahead of others at that time in looking at the ways that they want to be presented so that the best presentation is out in front of people and some of the other stuff might be in the background and not seen as much.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it goes along with just kind of an idealized Walt aligns with the concept of this fantasy and this perfect, magic kingdom that we're entering, right? It all aligns,
Yeah.
and I think it's, again, Disney theme parks are an escape from reality, which means you leave all of your baggage and your worries behind.
Yeah.
So I think, right, there is always going to be that, idolized or idealized version of Walt, which I don't want to get into this, right? But there's the whole the conversation about the audio animatronic version of Walt that was
Hmm. Yeah.
announced. And I know there's people that are for it and some people that think it shouldn't be done. That's obviously going to be, a hot topic in my next class for, what do you leave it preserved in history or do you try to bring it back to life? And what does that really mean? You
Yeah.
know? Um,
Um, yeah, and that's something that I actually recently talked with people about as well. And we'll talk about this semester in my class is how do you do that? Because I'm really interested in hearing the conversations around it, people's reactions to it, both good and or both positive and negative. I want to see kind of what that those conversations are. Um, so to keep going with the class and then we'll talk about the book after that. Um, excuse me, you drive from Kalamazoo through Chicago, through Marceline, you get to Kansas City. How long or how many days is that portion of the trip?
so we base that's the first 3 days. So we're basically
Okay,
doing one city a day. That's essentially what we do for the whole rest of the trip. And then from Kansas City, we fly to San Francisco,
okay.
which people are always surprised. Like, why are we going to San Francisco? What is connected to Walt Disney in San Francisco? And it's actually more than the Walt Disney Family Museum, but that is the major reason we stop. And then from there, we travel to Mineral King, which is a part of Sequoia
Mhm.
National Park, to talk about one of Walt's dreams that never came true, which was it's always a highlight, but this year in particular, the students just absolutely loved being in the
Mhm.
mountains. And then we go down and we spend some time in Hollywood and LA. And then we do Burbank and Glendale, and then we go to Disneyland. So that's essentially the 8 days.
Okay. So the trip does the trip end in Anaheim
It
or where
does.
does okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then from there,
We
does
fly
everyone
back,
fly
we
back
fly
to
back to Kalamazoo.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Um And so there are, I mean, when people think of Walt Disney, there are so many things with the state of California that people associate with Walt Disney. So just real quickly, I don't want you to have to spend a lot of time on it. But real quickly, can you go tell us some of the highlights of San Francisco and then on to
Sure.
LA and Hollywood and some of those things so people who may not know
Yeah.
kind of are exposed to more of that.
Yeah. So in San Francisco, the Walt Disney Family Museum is a multi-million dollar tribute to Walt Disney. And it was his daughter, Diane Disney Miller, who could have written a book about Walt, but she chose to make the museum because she wanted to tell the family story. She wanted to tell the personal side of Walt, not the corporate side. And so to me, that's for when we go there, it's a recap, right, of the first 3 days because they've got exhibits about his life in all of those cities. But then just to be able to see personal artifacts from him
Hmm.
and to hear his voice and to see one of the multi-plane cameras that was innovative. So that's always a pivotal stop for us. What else in San Francisco is we always make a little mini stop at Treasure Island, which was where the Golden Gate Exposition was, because that's where Walt fell in love with miniatures.
Mm.
Uh, and so that became a hobby of his. And so just talking about what did Walt do outside of work, which is why we also do a lawn bowling lesson in Beverly Hills because, again, Walt did polo, he did lawn bowling, he was just like anyone else, and he had things outside of work to relieve stress, occupy his
Hmm.
mind. So then from San Francisco, then we head down to Mineral King, which most people would look at me and say I'm crazy for driving 2 hours to go 25 miles, to hike for an hour, to then turn around and drive 2 more hours down the mountain. Because it's a long drive and it's winding, right? There's 700 curves on that,
Okay.
ascent. But it's, most people don't know that Disney still owns property there. And I verified that with Tulare
Hmm.
County. They sent me the tax records and how much Walt Disney pays every year for that
Hmm.
property that they can never build on, but they're hanging on to it. But just to talk about what was going to be built there, but then also realize that sometimes when a project doesn't come to fruition, we get to reap the benefits of this beautiful land now that will never be built on. Even though that was a, you know, never happened.
Hmm.
So then from there, this past year we made a stop at Cal Arts, the California Institute of Arts, which
Oh,
most people
okay.
don't know that Walt Disney co-created a four-year university, kind of a Cal Poly, but Cal Arts,
Hmm.
focused on, art, music, theater, dance, animation, all of that. So of course the students were just thrilled to see a, 113, 113 from,
Yeah.
the movies. And so that's kind of a little bit of a celebrity sighting, even without a celebrity being there. Um, and then, we retrace, some things in LA. One of the most popular stops this year, which was not popular last year, and the students told me take it off the trip, but I chose not to listen sometimes, was a visit to the Walt Disney Concert Hall, which
Mm.
obviously is a tribute to Walt, right? It's one of only a few performing spaces named for Walt, but it's also an opportunity to talk about how Lillian, his wife, saw Walt and why she did this as a tribute, and Diane's involvement. So they were just blown away by that structure, right? It's also an opportunity to see architecture,
Yeah.
uh,
It's a
and
very beautiful like building as well. Like it's very, very striking to look at. So
yes. I mean, one of my dreams one day would be that we could stay and go to a performance in that
yeah.
space. This was only the second time in 8 years of teaching that we saw the inside of the performance space, because there's
Okay.
always usually a rehearsal going on and you can't peek behind the doors.
Yeah.
But this time they had it open and we actually walked in, and it's amazing. It's one of the few performance spaces that has windows,
Hmm.
because most
Okay.
auditoriums are, there are no windows in there. They obviously close the curtains, but when you do want natural daylight, it's pretty cool to see it. So,
Yeah.
and then we have lunch at the Tam O'Shanter, where Walt Disney always used to have meals before, the commissary was available. Um, and then one of the coolest things that we got to see this year, first time ever, we got to see Uncle Robert's house completely renovated,
Okay.
because that was Walt's first stay in 1923 when he got off the train from Kansas City. And so Walt's granddaughter, Joanna, and Walt's grandson, Nick, purchased the house and for 5 years have been restoring it. And so we had the opportunity to see inside and out. So talk about a place in history and a piece in,
Yeah.
place in time, to just think back that, you know,
Is is that also where is that where Walt and Lillian got married in the backyard? Or is that was
so
that somewhere else?
no, that was Roy and Edna got married at Uncle
Okay.
Robert's house,
Okay. Thank
because
you.
Walt and Lillian got married in Lewiston, Idaho, at
Okay.
Lillian's brother's house.
Okay.
Yeah, and I actually met somebody this year when we were at Disneyland who went to Lewiston to see the house where they got
Oh,
married.
cool.
So she was
Cool.
showing me
Very cool.
pictures. You run into these Disney fans, and I was like, only a true Disney fan would have photos of the house where they got married in the middle of Idaho.
Yeah. So then what so then you're LA, you make the trip down to Burbank. What are some of the highlights from, I mean, you get to Anaheim. The highlights obviously would be one, Disneyland.
Mhm.
Are there other things that you visit in Anaheim as well?
No, it's really just Disneyland, and we always make sure that we do the Walt's Main Street tour, or what used to be Walk in Walt Disney's
Okay.
Disneyland steps, so we can see his apartment.
Yeah.
That's always a very special moment, right? You think about all of the sacred places that we get to see in Walt's life, from the birthplace to his boyhood home in Marceline to the apartment, um, to even Laugh-O-Gram Film Studios, right? Which again is undergoing,
Yeah.
they're renovating the building. But to just be in those places that where Walt spent time and were important places to him, you know.
Yeah.
So to me, and it's a little bit of, somewhat VIP access, some of which are open to the public. But fortunately, I have formed some really good, connections and folks who've been very generous in offering up the opportunity to see the space, because they think it's pretty cool that students are getting academic credit to study Walt Disney's life.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you mentioned a way for people to keep up with the class, and that being the emphasis for the book, Walt's Pilgrimage. I don't know if I can properly see it with my background, but so this tell us about this because it's fantastic. The actually I'm looking at Walt Disney Concert Hall right here, the beautiful building. But it's like a trip through his life, and the things that us as non-students can do in these places. So tell us about this.
Yeah, so after teaching the course for a couple of years and realizing that if I only take eight students and I do this for 10 years, that's only 80 people that ever will get to
Hmm.
experience this course. And I was like, that's like hardly anybody, right? And I have done a private version of Walt's Pilgrimage, just the 3 day version with some folks that wanted me to, to do it for them. But I started thinking, I was like, you know what, there's going to be other Disney fans who want this experience. What could I do? And so, based on gathering all of this information, I mean, all I did was from 2014 to 2017, as I was building the course and further refining it, I mean, I was just living, breathing every piece of information I could learn about Walt Disney. So, of course, I had it all spinning in my head. I had it documented. I had my curriculum. And then I was like, what if I put this all down in a book? And it
Hmm.
almost becomes, which is why the title shows that it's, part travel guide, part biography, part history, right? It's this unique concept of, again, using geography to tell Walt's story, and for
Hmm.
people to realize that you might have something in your own state or multiple things that have a Walt Disney connection that you never knew about.
Hmm.
And so it was kind of my way of letting people do their own pilgrimage or pick and choose places, and learn just a little bit about Walt, right? I mean, you could read his biography and you're going to get, that chronological story about him, but this gives you snippets. And also, I think for me, it was about why is this place important in Walt's
Hmm.
life?
And you mentioned people looking at their own state. The first thing I did, as I looked up Tennessee, to see if there's anything in Tennessee, to see if there's anything in Texas, and see if there's anything in Nebraska, that that we would be able to go see when we're either here or visiting family. So
And I don't think you found any of those, unfortunately, right?
no, no, didn't find
But
any of those.
But
But
the cool thing is that I do like I need to come up with an updated version of it because as I've obviously continued to do my research, I am finding new places that
okay, yeah,
emerge in the history. So there are some new I probably have added another 15 to 20 sites that you can learn more about Walter, have a connection.
yeah. I did the last time when we went to, or the last time we were in St. Louis, and we went to the Arch. I did share with the boys. I said, this was first. This was like they had plans. It was almost finalized. This was going to be like an entertainment center of Walt Disney was going to build an entertainment center here. And one of the growing up in Texas, I grew up in East Texas, and there was always a rumor that that was one of the places he had looked at land to build, either when he was before he built Walt Disney World, trying to decide on Walt Disney World, or the company had looked afterwards and said like, hey, this would be another location where maybe we could be. And then I imagine there are probably 1,000 places or more where that exact rumor is told. Like, hey, look at this piece of land. This was,
Right.
once considered, it could have been Walt Disney World, that type of thing. Um,
Right.
I did want to ask about the research because there's so much in here. Where what is your research process like? Is this all, are these, is most of this original source? Like you're having to go to original source to find all of this? Where are you able to piece this together? Because in particular, like there's one place in Alaska
Mhm.
where, you write about like they made him and his daughter, one of his daughters took a trip there.
Yeah.
And there's I think it said there's nothing there that you could see. Like there's not a statue or plaque or anything that says he was there. Like, so how are you able to find all of this information?
So, my goal was to collect, as many different sources as I can. And I think, one thing when I read something, then I try to find other sources that also can validate that. the challenge was, right, I was always going down a rabbit hole, right? I would find
Mhm.
about something and then I'd be like, oh my gosh, here's another connection to another location. And now what whether it's for good or bad, whenever I read anything now about Walt Disney, I'm reading it with a geographic perspective
Mhm.
of like, oh, is that a site, a new site, or is that a new, a new connection? But I did a little, I would say I did a combination of sourcing from existing content that was written that I knew was, you know, um, validated by other people. Like, for example, when I reached out to the Walt Disney Family Museum, I asked them, what is the recommended biography that you recommend? And that, they had said the Bob Thomas book. I mean, I've read the, Hollywood Star Prince. I've read, Neil's book. I'm actually rereading Neil's book right now because I feel like it'll be a good refresh
Mhm.
on it. But uh, I would solicit opinions from other people, or again, try to find multiple sources that, confirmed it. Or sometimes I would go and do my own, like this whole,
Mhm.
because I'd heard the rumor like Walt Disney still owns property. The company still owns property in Mineral Cake. And I was like, do they? I mean, I wanted to believe it, but I was like, all right, where's the source of truth? It's with the tax assessor, it's with the county. And they were more
Yeah.
than happy to share that information. Or like the Mineral King Preservation Society has a lot of documentation about that
Mhm.
project because Bob Hicks was hired by Disney and his collection is in their collection now. So I would say it's a wide variety. One thing that was important for me when I wrote the book was to cite everything so that if somebody wanted to validate or confirm or read more,
Yeah.
they had that. That was like the academic in me coming out because a couple people were like, "Why did you do all that citation?" And I was like, this is also kind of a reference guide,
Yeah.
if you will. But I also, for things that weren't common knowledge, I wanted to cite, and for anything that was common knowledge, where did it come from?
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah, and it's incredibly interesting. It's very, very fun. And it's it's really, really cool to look at and just see all of the different places. Like here, I just flipped to a page real quick and I see the plaque that was at the 1960 Winter Games. Um, and for people who don't know, the Walt Disney Company um, played a very, very large role in those Olympic Games, being head of pageantry, in charge of pageantry. But they also, that went on to in 1980 when the games were in Los Angeles. You know, their logistical, uh, the help they gave logistically to selling tickets, crowd control, and then the Olympics are going to be back in Los Angeles in 2028. I spoke a few weeks ago to somebody, and we speculated about what kind of involvement will the Walt Disney Company have in those because they have had such strong involvement in the past with many of the games that have been played or
yeah.
held in the United States. And so it's it's really, really fascinating. I want to talk about some of the rapid questions
Okay,
that I have. But
sure.
before we do, is there anything that maybe I've left out you think is important to cover, spend a little bit more time on, or any other works that you have that you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah, I want to go back to the class and when we were talking about assignments. One of the assignments I did for a number of years that I changed and it's been replaced by the film clips analysis was I used to have students at the end of the course create their own pilgrimage about another person, right? So, and
Okay.
usually sometimes people would pick, a famous celebrity or somebody historical or somebody in the field that they're going into. And they had to put together a travel itinerary and do a whole Google map. And it was actually really cool to see them translate Walt's pilgrimage into something else that, they could put together. But I decided to bring it back, the assignment to Walt.
Mhm.
And it also stressed them out to have so much work to do after the trip. It was like they were exhausted. They do write an 8-page reflection paper at the end where they pick one photo from each day and they hate it because it's only one photo. And they've taken like 100, every day. But for me, it's also very cool to see what mattered to them and what did they learn.
Yeah.
from that. And I added another twist to that where they have to write about one artifact that they got. And one of the
Okay.
most popular ones that I've been doing for a number of years is that when we're in Kansas City, even though we're hopping on a plane and not a train like Walt took, I give them, kind of a mock-up version of a train ticket from
Yeah.
1923, and I give them $40 of play money, which is what Walt had in his pocket when he left Kansas City. And it's so fascinating how that is so leaves such an imprint on them about what that was like for Walt and what $40 is today, right?
Yeah.
Hardly. I mean, wasn't a lot of money. I mean, it was somewhat not very much money, right? If that's all you had in your pocket.
Yeah.
So to me, it's also about the artifacts besides the places that we visit, the things that you can tell Walt's story through that to make it a little bit real, like they're holding what Walt held in his
Yeah.
hand or in his pocket. So, in terms of projects, so I am close to finishing a new children's book about Mineral King. So I
Okay.
this year when we visited Mineral King and we went to the Three Rivers Historical Museum, they did a phenomenal presentation about there's always been, whether this is myth or truth, on whether or not the Country Bear Jamboree was that a project that was supposed to be at Mineral King, or was it always intended to be at Walt Disney World? And so there's lots of different iterations of that story. So they use that as an example for my students to be like, is this true or not? And how do we find out if it's true or not? Right. And it's still unresolved, but it was another example of that lesson. But when we were there, the light bulb went off to me because there's been a few new books written about Mineral King, and I love reading them because it's such a fascinating story about environmentalism and what was going on in the world. But I was like, I think it would be neat it's so because there's so much legalese with the Supreme Court case with that. I was like,
Mhm.
how do I bring that down to like, an elementary school level to just talk about a dream, nature, and the dream that never happened, right? To
Yeah.
just sometimes not all dreams do come true, but look what we have today as a result. So that book, I'm going to be working with an illustrator, and the goal is to have that published early in 2025.
Okay. And that's fascinating. That's something that I definitely want to get my hands on. And um I in the future I've reached out to, we just haven't nailed down a date and a time to talk with the authors about Disneyland in the mountains, or Disneyland on the
Oh,
mountain.
yeah. Yeah.
Um
Greg.
and so
Yeah.
having that, maybe we need to have another conversation about that as well, because it is truly, truly fascinating. And you're the first person I've heard talk about, it's disputed or undecided if Country Bear Jamboree actually came from there, because that's the story I've always told, or I've always heard. That's the
Mhm.
story I've told.
Right.
So it's really, really interesting to hear that perspective. I can't wait to read more about that, and to
Yeah.
hear more about that.
Yeah. It
So
was, it was a really, I think, reminded again the students that like, yeah, how do and what kind of position does that put you in? Like, especially, I think they were asking me, like, Dr. Tremblay, you told us, because literally, you'll find this somewhat entertaining. As we're driving up to the museum, I was like, okay, you guys, so, the story goes that the Country Bear Jamboree was planned for Mineral King, right? And then we go into the museum and they give this whole presentation about, well, do you guys think that's true? And of course, they're all nodding their head because I just told them, and they were like, well, actually, let us tell you how we think it might not be true, right? And then the students are all looking at me and they were like, how did that make you feel? And I was like, I go, I mean, a little bit uncomfortable, but not surprising. This isn't the first time that Disney knowledge has been gray,
yeah,
and so, it was good because we could have a real conversation about like that whole concept, and
yeah,
and it might have inspired people to be like, well, I might need to dig into this because now I want to know like what is the truth.
yeah. Well, and to me, it's another example of that, the curated information, the curated messaging of, here are the stories, that that have been curated, that have been told, and that that's truly fascinating. So thank you for talking to us about this. Thank you for talking to us about the book, about the class, about your fandom. It's really, really cool. I have a few rapid questions. The way these are, uh, you can explain. That's fine. You don't have to give any explanation at all. A lot of them are about the parks,
Okay.
but then I have a few about the class
Okay.
and about the book.
Okay.
So,
Let's go.
any first one, any this could be any park that you've been to. Do you have a favorite Disney park?
Yes, Walt Disney World.
Okay. Um, in any place you've been, do you have a favorite attraction or ride? Could be a ride or a show. Favorite attraction.
Space Mountain, hands down.
Okay. And Walt Disney World
Yeah,
or
yeah, at the Magic Kingdom. I think because it was the first roller coaster that I ever read, and or yeah, and it was a road, and it was I think the thing that at least back from what I remember back in the 1970s, because I think it may have changed, but our little starship only sat three people, and I was a
yeah,
family of three, and it was one of the few times that I remember that my family could all ride together
yeah.
without having two side by side. So it was I don't know why that always sticks in my head in terms of the ride design, but uh, that was just it was and it was fun to be in the dark.
Yeah, the a funny story about Space Mountain this last year when we went to Disneyland, and we rode Space Mountain. And the Space Mountain in Disneyland, because it was built after the one in Orlando, um, it is so the track, the car layout, it's so much more easier of a ride. It doesn't beat you up near as much as the one in Florida. And I was talking to a cast member and they said, "Oh, that's because we have the Space Mountain here that they learned from Florida, but have you been on the Matterhorn yet?" Like, yeah, they're like, yeah, that's the one here at this park that's very, very rough on you. So,
Right.
um, favorite Disney hotel anywhere you've been?
Ooh, I'm definitely partial to the Grand Floridian just for its
Okay.
classiness and kind of, a little bit back in time concept.
Okay. Do you have a favorite restaurant?
Um, ooh, that's a good one. I think one in name is, of course, Walt's in Disneyland Paris.
Okay.
I've not been to it, but it's on my list when I return because I've been to that park once. Um, let me think. Um, I do I like Storytellers Cafe at the or Storytellers Restaurant at the Grand Californian Resort.
Okay. All right. And then um outside of the or in the parks, Disney Springs, downtown Disney, anywhere, do you have a favorite snack?
Favorite snack? Mm, I probably don't have a favorite snack.
Okay. All right. And then so these next two, these are about you could answer about the book or the class. You can draw on your answer from the book or the class. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
And you don't have to just give one. You
Okay.
can give multiple because I know it might be difficult. But is there a favorite part about the trip for you, Walt's pilgrimage, or a favorite part or two or three that really kind of stand out that are just extra special to you?
Yes. Immediately, hands down, Marceline, Missouri. And it's essentially because uh, my students are transformed with pixie dust after that day every single year. And it like without fail. They become closer, this tight knit community that hosts us at Marceline. There is just something special about that town that transforms my students, unlike any other stop that we make. It's consistent and mind blowing and sometimes indescribable. And
Hmm.
that it's so powerful that I just every year I'm like, it's probably going to happen again, but what if it doesn't? But it always
Yeah.
does, right? I would say the thing that probably for me has been most significant in this entire journey was it's a two-parter. It was the day that I got an email from Ron Miller, Walt Disney's son-in-law, after I had reached out to him through Silverado Winery, that was owned by them. And Ron Miller gave me a cell phone number and asked him to call him. And I
Hmm.
was a nervous wreck, right? I mean, here, a former CEO of the company, uh, obviously who had been ousted by the company, right? Walt Disney's son-in-law personally knew Walt, and I called him, and he, I wasn't sure how he was going to respond because my request was I wanted my students to meet somebody from the Disney family, and I didn't know if that would be possible, but I just thought I want them to hear something from an original source, right, of people who knew Walt. So he says to me, he's like, I normally don't take these kind of calls or handle these kinds of requests. And I knew why, right? I mean, he's somewhat of a celebrity, Disney, connected. He goes, but he goes, my wife, Diane, would have loved this course, and I'm going to do this for her.
Oh, that's
And it
cool.
was just, yeah, it was just very touching, his approach. And so he hosted us at the Walt Disney Family Museum for lunch, in the conference room, and we got to have one-on-one conversations. We could ask him anything we wanted about Walt. And I will just never forget that, that he was so willing to do that. And, yeah, it was pretty special. And it's too bad that he passed away because we got that opportunity twice in the 8 years. So I will just always forever hold that in my heart as a very special moment. I may not have ever been able to meet Walt, but I got pretty darn close.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. The last one, um, do you have a favorite or multiple ones that stand out to you? A fact that either you share in the book or with your students during the class, during the pilgrimage? Something that you like your favorite thing you like to share with people, that people may not know, or two or three.
And the one we've already talked about that comes to mind is, I'm usually educating people about Mineral King,
Okay.
and again, talking about things that never came to fruition. Um, I often like talking about Epcot, from the concept of not the theme park, right, of what became Walt's idea, but the original prototype community
Hmm.
of tomorrow, and to really talk about Walt's emerging interest in urban planning, which is somewhat fascinating because I now work for. I do college admissions for the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. So, like when you think architecture, you can also think about castles that are in the
Hmm.
Disney theme parks. And when you think about urban planning, you think about his layout in the park, which was rejected by many people. You cannot have a singular entrance with the spokes coming out. Like that's just going to be awful for crowd control and all of that. So I really love talking about where Walt was going when he
Hmm.
died, and, the things that he was planning for the next iteration of what would be that we never got to see. Two projects survived and two didn't, right? The ones that didn't were Epcot, as a community, and Mineral King, but the ones that made it through were obviously Walt Disney World and Cal Arts. But
Yeah.
the fact that he had his hands in four different things in 1966, like in four different kind of, you know, industries, if you will, like just fascinating, right? I
Yeah.
think it tells you a lot about his creativity and synergy and pushing the boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really, really cool. Thank you for sharing all of this. Dr. Tremblay, this has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot from this. Um, One thing I've learned is maybe the Country Bear Jamboree did not come from Mineral King. I need to find out more about that. I'll look for your book when it comes out about that. How's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Sure. Yeah. The best way is through the website, waltspilgrimage.com. So I talk about the class, information about my books. You can take a couple of, quizzes out there, and other resources. But yeah, that's the best way to reach out to me and to connect with me.
Okay. All right. And thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. And thanks for your time. Have a great rest of the day.
Yeah. Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.